Welcome to AI and the Autonomous Supply Chain, an in-depth look at the future of business planning and intelligent data apps, all made possible by Blue Yonder. My name is Dave Vellante and I'm here with my co-host, George Gilbert. And we're happy to invite in Gurdip Singh, who's the Chief Product Officer at Blue Yonder. Gurdip, thanks for making some time. Good to see you.
So good to see you, Dave, and you as well, George. Wonderful to have this opportunity to discuss more about supply chains, and I hope so much more at such an interesting time in the markets.
Well, let's take a look back and look forward, if you will. How has the supply chain management evolved from your perspective? What would you say are the most significant shifts in that space over the last decade or so?
You know, Dave, supply chain used to be an obscure topic that when you mentioned it to most people, particularly at dinners, social events, it caused people to walk away from you, not so much anymore. I think all of us, particularly in today's day and age, are acutely aware of what supply chains mean to our lives. And so it's a lot easier conversation. I get invited to a lot more parties. I'm supposedly a more interesting person all of a sudden. But honestly, this has become, in some sense, pretty much since the pandemic, become the central, most important topic for boardrooms and enterprises throughout. And it basically comes down to this. We're living in a world of uncertainty. It's hard to manage that uncertainty, and companies are looking for all kinds of tools and capabilities to not just try and figure out what to do in the here and now, but actually take the time to figure out what that midterm and long-term strategy is going to be across all their business functions. And Blue Yonder is well equipped to help them manage it.
Yeah, and so of course retail is a main area of focus when you talk about supply chain, but I mean, whether it's automotive, whether it's pharma, I mean, I heard the other day that the services sector was going to get hit with tariffs, and there's a supply chain in a services business. So how should we think about the industries that are going to be affected by the future?
Yep, you're so right, Dave. I think it's a mistake to think of it as being just this industry or that, just auto or pharmaceuticals or high tech that's going to get impacted. It's ubiquitous. And it really comes down to understanding that, life was hard enough just within the enterprise, trying to get all the different stakeholders to align on business objectives and constraints. And all of a sudden now, things that you took for granted about the suppliers being there and the inflow of goods and inventory following a certain path, and carriers being there and there being enough capacity because the flow paths were well understood, all those assumptions just got tossed out of the window. And you're now in a position where you're having to manage all this uncertainty without necessarily knowing the rules of the road. And so, if fundamentally, in some sense, people were very used to working with a single number and a simple set of assumptions, all of a sudden they're having to live in this world where they need to be able to evaluate all of the risks and opportunities that their business faces, to do that at machine speed and with precision, and to make sure that when they do come to a conclusion, that is something that their suppliers and carriers can also agree with. And so it's a much more complicated world than it's ever been.
And George, before we get into the technical details, I wanted to sort of one more setup question. You know, Gurdip, I remember, and George, you remember this well, back in the big data days, we used to talk about real time, and we defined real time as before you lose the customer. So it was kind of a fuzzy definition. And that, you think about real time and time to delivery, whether it's in e-commerce, I mean, everything's shrinking. How do you think about speed as a critical enabler for today's supply chain? And what is that sort of new definition of real time? It's never fast enough, but how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, and I think the best way to firstly describe that is it's not just speed; it's speed with precision. Because you don't want to just move fast and crash into something. You got to be able to make decisions quickly. But the real definition, the way I think of it, Dave, in some senses, if you can squeeze the time out of the lag between when you decide you want to do something to when it actually gets done, you actually take out the oxygen from the room that feeds that uncertainty, that feeds that problem in terms of costs and additional inventory that you see all around you. So in many ways, the speed at which an enterprise needs to operate is essentially the speed that will close down that gap between deciding and acting which happens to be pretty large. I'll give you an example, talking about retail. A large multi-billion-dollar retailer with over 100 billion in revenue realized that a change that they initiated in terms of the supplier orders that they need to place caused a lot of grief and a back and forth between their suppliers and carriers and even their own warehouse operations teams, that the only thing that they could do was actually take 2 days of supply and plonk it down into the warehouse just so that they could deal with all of that chaos, if you will. Taking just a single day of inventory at that large of a retailer that has dozens of distribution centers, just 1 day at one site is $9.1 million of inventory. So not pocket change. And when you think about all the skyrocketing food prices nowadays, imagine the food waste that was happening because they'd added those 2 days of supply. So plenty of opportunity if we can just squeeze that time out of deciding when we want to do something and actually being able to execute to it with precision, with reliability, and yes, with speed.
Yeah, and you're seeing a lot of brute force techniques today, given the public policy climate, and probably a lot of overbuying, like we would buy over capacity before the cloud. George, why don't you pick it up from here?
So Gurdip, I want to pick up on something you said that sounds really profound, which is eliminating that gap between understanding and action, or decision and action. And I want to put that in the context of the sort of enterprise architecture that's built up in a sedimentary way over many decades. The sort of the core operational application was enterprise resource planning, but it didn't cover very much of, or it didn't cover anywhere near all of operations. And it was built around efficiency. It was static. It was about how do we wring more efficiency out of essentially fixed assets. Now, when you want to look forward, when you want to eliminate uncertainty and convert that into action, but you want that action to align all your operations, not just ERP or whatever. And we look past just supply chain planning to this new concept of integrated business planning. So 2 questions. You have a greater need for a scope and fidelity of forward-looking analytics and operations, tying them together. Maybe touch on the requirements for scale and how you achieve that, but also the fidelity, how you harmonize all those different legacy systems so that you can perceive and act.
Great question, George, as always, very, very perceptive. I'm gonna try and answer your question by pointing out to 4 very distinct innovations from a technological perspective that have helped us solve this problem much more effectively today than we've ever been able to do in the past. The first of which is the data cloud. And data cloud, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is basically technology that has emerged from all of the experiences we've had, where there is now a distinct need to separate out data storage from compute. And to be able to do this is super important when you're trying to create an architecture that allows you to bring together in one place, finally, all of the different data that is required to run your business operations. And so this means everything that you need for making business planning decisions, for financial decisions, for your logistics and warehouse operations, down to the lowest level of transaction, now needs to be brought together in one place so that that goodness of that atomic information can be used to make higher level decisions. That's first. But the important technology, and now the second one that I'm going to talk about, is the knowledge graph that allows you to define in a semantic manner, in a human understandable manner, all the different constraints and relationships that exist between the data so that it can be brought to bear. And the reason it's important for this to be in a human readable manner is because, you know what? Businesses are not static. ERPs were mistaken when they set it up in that very static mode that takes forever to change, which is why you find so many business organizations so frustrated with their technology teams because they cannot keep up with the speed of change that businesses want. And what the semantic networks do, the knowledge graph does for you, is create that flexibility. And so if you take that first innovation of the data cloud and marry it to the knowledge graph, all of a sudden you've got not just the data at the lowest level of granularity, you now have the ability from a business perspective to marry that data together in an understandable manner. The third technology element that's absolutely key is moving away from the notion of making decisions on batches in processes that run overnight. You are now moving to much more of an event-driven framework that allows you to make decisions at that speed that businesses demand, but also at the speed at which events are occurring. And you as an organization can now make a decision at what latency you want your business to respond. And the last, and certainly not by any means the least important element, is the network of how things come together. For the longest time, and going back to the ERP days, like you mentioned, it was all about the enterprise. And again, I think that's a fundamentally limiting way of looking at information. You have to look at the entirety of the ecosystem. None of us know enterprise by itself, whether it's a services company, a software company, or a products company. None of them operate by themselves in islands. They're all tied to their ecosystem of suppliers and carriers and partners. And having the ability to bring all of them together through the network allows you to make sure that not only is there synchronicity between the objectives and constraints as each party understands it, but quite frankly, it's good for every member of that network because they can all grow their business just by being there. So these four technological elements begin to address that problem that you outlined, George. And there's very many interesting aspects of how we've applied that to supply chain that I'm sure we can discuss more going forward.
If I can sum up or ask a question to get you to distill down, like in the ERP era, we had this sort of one metric maybe at the end of the day. It was return on invested capital, which was really a measure of asset utilization and efficiency, and even in organizational efficiency. Do you have a metric now for this ecosystem intelligence and agility, converting like the sense, turning the perception into operational action, even beyond the borders of one organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, one of the best metrics, one of the best ways I've ever heard anyone describe it is when Duncan Nangle, our CEO, set out the objective for what we're trying to accomplish. What he articulated for us, George, was we're trying to usher in the era of sustainable abundance. It's not just abundance, it's sustainable abundance. And what that gives you is really a North Star for what all of these various capabilities should be aspiring to. We should be able to deliver our products to our consumers with far greater efficiency. And so in many ways, it should be about, yes, the business objective of what it takes from a cost to serve perspective, not just a reduction in the cost per unit in a warehouse or the miles driven in the logistics network or the days of supply of inventory. It really is from a business efficiency perspective, what is that cost to serve for the customer? And oh, by the way, that definition of cost to serve includes what is the waste that is occurring? What is the inefficiency that is occurring? And so we've tried to focus in on delivering to that objective of sustainable abundance and defining our metrics that allow us to move in that direction.
And if I could ask a follow-up question. So the data cloud, the knowledge graph, and the network all exist inside of the Blue Yonder platform. The advantage of, from a customer standpoint, that's a prerequisite, that it's got to be inside that platform. The advantage is you get that event-driven decision-making, that low latency decision-making. First of all, is that correct? And
absolutely, yes.
And how do you what do you say to the customer that says, well, I got stuff that's outside of that platform? Is the answer, well, if you really want that benefit, you got to bring it in? Are there other ways to encapsulate that? And what are the trade-offs there?
Yeah, so Dave, in today's day and age, it's not possible for any technology company to walk in and say, thou shalt live on this one platform and nothing else. We're very aware of the need to operate in a heterogeneous IT landscape That's a given. I think what it comes down to is the degree of business benefit you want to deliver. And so, going back to that objective of sustainable abundance, absolutely, we can help you do a number of things, even though you may not be leveraging the entirety of the Blue Yonder set of capabilities, because we are an API first company. But what that means is you may not get the full benefit if you were using all of the different capabilities. It's much like, you can always use different apps on your iPhone or your Android device. But if you have them all working together, you get to an entirely different experience. And that's what you get from the promise of Blue Yonder and the network and the platform and all of these capabilities being together through the platform.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and that of course becomes a Blue Yonder moat. And then, it's very relevant today. We've got two really stark examples of disruption, the pandemic, and now we've seen, what's happening with the tariffs. So if I'm trying to plan for these disruptions, these, largely black swan events, how do you envision integrated demand and supply planning dealing with whether it's pandemics and geopolitical tensions, and how does this integrated approach address those? Maybe you could take us through, how your customers are dealing with some of these dislocations today.
Yeah, and one thing I will say, Dave and George, is this is really, in some sense, part two of a show that started with the pandemic, and many companies learned and put in place very good lessons coming out of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the lessons they learned is that this is not a once and done thing. We'd all wish for this to be occurring less frequently, but virtually every customer I speak with is now thinking of this being an ongoing concern that is not going to be something that just goes away no matter what happens. And so the way we're seeing this happen quite interestingly is customers are actually taking a step back and thinking about the entirety of the process, the integrated demand and supply planning, as well as integrated business planning activities. And they are thinking about the kinds of tools and capabilities that will help them pull this all together. So for instance, in order to make good decisions of how products should flow to my consumer, I probably need to reimagine a few different ways, different by the way than how things are happening today, where it may be more effective if the tariffs came into play, or if other constraints were brought to bear. Then where should the product be produced? How should it be flowed? What will be the financial impact? In addition to making sure that whatever decisions that they make in that strategic horizon are concurrently going to also be true when they are looking at their day-to-day operations, because they know they can't just make the switch at the snap of a finger. So there's a whole continuum of making that decision and making sure that those decisions are actually going to hold true and be real is something that we're helping companies do right now. The second thing that's very important, the second concurrency, as I call it, is this need to be able to make decisions at the aggregate level. Now, this is important because with all of the change that's happening, you cannot possibly make the decision just for one or two products. You have to take a step back and look at entire regions, all categories of products you may be serving in that region. And you want to do that at that higher level with the assurance that when you do go down to the detail level, it's not going to be disconnected. And so being able to make decisions through processes at different levels of aggregation becomes super important. By the way, that's a great application of the knowledge graph. And the third concurrency, as I like to call it, is this concurrency of making sure all of your constraints are being handled together. And what I mean by that, again, is it can't just be about manufacturing or distribution. It's also got to be about your warehousing capabilities. It's also got to be about your ability to meet the customer demand in the time frame and at the cost that the customer expects it to be. So you've got to be able to take a step back and concurrently manage your constraints across all of these different dimensions. So really, in some sense, what I'm seeing customers want and adopt more and more in this demand and supply planning process is this concurrency around looking at different horizons and the boundaryless way making decisions at different levels of aggregation, and being assured that it's going to actually all still hang together because it works in a synchronous way. And by the way, the last one, the concurrency around all of these constraints that are out there in different dimensions and making sure that they are looked at simultaneously. So you're not kind of after the fact having to figure out how to solve a problem that's going to cost you a lot of money. So that's what I'm seeing happening in the marketplace today.
Let me ask a follow-up on that, because that sounds like both a profoundly difficult technical challenge, but a profound change in organizational capability. So maybe in the past, when you had planning separated from operations, and it might have even been a staff exercise, there was human alignment to take a plan and execute it across or implement it across different siloed operations. What have you seen in terms of change of best practices among some of your leading customers when they have all those three levels, three perspectives working in conjunction, where planning cycles can go from whether it's a year or a quarter to, down to what sort of time frame?
Yeah. So George, really, really insightful question, right? So I think in some sense on the technology side, this has been where Blue Yonder has been really fortunate to have made the investments that it's made and created the partnerships that it has with Snowflake, with relational AI, with Microsoft, to be able to deliver this kind of capability for supply chain with a lot of that goodness and IP coming from Blue Yonder's heritage in planning and optimization. But just as importantly, the advent of both predictive and generative AI to helping make those decisions quickly. We've done, I think we've created for ourselves a technological mode that's interesting and I think unsurpassable at this point in time. But what's even more interesting is how I see our customers now interact to it. They are moving forward, recognizing what you just said. This is an opportunity for them to reimagine how work was done, not just how it was done, but where it's done. So, all of a sudden, in doing your work, you have at your disposal AI agents that can be your teammates, not just there as your assistants to do things that you ask them to do, but actually teammates that can do the deep research for you and can actually run all these scenarios for you and present you with the options. So we're now engaged with our customers. In fact, we've done hundreds of such conversations through design thinking exercises where we've sat down with customers who've told us, you know what, your old way of doing things where you just identified exceptions is not good enough. We need you to do something a lot more. And we don't need all these people involved in these kinds of activities because you can get that information to us much more effectively. So we are working closely to reimagine how, for instance, the exception workflow is replaced by an insight-driven planning workflow that's got these root causes that's already identified for our users by the AI agents, along with resolution paths that are also available for them. Simultaneously, we're now engaging in conversations where customers are coming to us and saying, why am I going into a meeting and using a static PowerPoint to make a very static presentation and then maybe take action items at the end of the meeting? Why don't I actually use the business planning solution, whether it's for demand and supply or integrated business planning? Why don't I use these capabilities to actually actively discuss and decide during the meeting what needs to be done so the meetings become more productive? And oh, by the way, with all of the capabilities that are there, you can actually do it now. So people are reimagining how organizations are set up, how day-to-day work is defined, and that's creating a huge opportunity for our customers to rethink how they should be organized to take advantage of the capabilities that are there, but more importantly, to meet the challenges that are coming their way.
So let's pick up on this if we could. Go ahead, George, you got another question?
Yeah, it's just a follow-up on that. That's Gurdip, this was really, really interesting because what I heard was there's this a collaborative work environment and dynamic replanning and operationalizing those plans. And my question is, in conjunction with the knowledge graph, I want to tie in the technology and a new way of work and a new way of building out the application, which is once you have the knowledge graph with all the business rules and constraints, when an exception happens, can an agent have better information now to diagnose not just what happened, but why it happened, predict what's likely to happen and suggest a remediation. And then that exception becomes, if the human supervisor or the team accepts that, that becomes something that is made repeatable. An agent might learn that, or might materialize that in the knowledge graph, so that if something like that happens again, it becomes an automatic condition. It doesn't have to involve human oversight.
That's exactly right, George. You almost played out verbatim what internally we are calling as the SADA loop for our agents to follow. So there's this see, analyze, decide, and act loop, that acronym of SADA, if you will, that we've come up with to essentially describe what we want our agents to be able to do. And when you think about all of the data that's available to them today, and both enterprise data, but also from the network, you're in a position to actually create exactly what you described, which is those smart prescriptions that allow you to understand, reason what the data is saying, and then using the kind of intelligence that is available to you from the services that we have exposed, call the requisite simulation capabilities, but more importantly, actioning capabilities to go through the decision and actioning steps that are part of the SADA loop. And as you use the agents repeatedly, these aren't static, they are learning what needs to be done. And the secret sauce in many ways is if you do have the right knowledge graph technology, you not only make it easier for the reasoning or the analysis, because they understand the semantics of what the data is trying to communicate so much more precisely. This is the important part. But when it comes time to, for instance, go back and nudge or recommend to the user what action they should take, because they now have the ability to see repeatedly through the process and the information that's garnered within the process, that 9 times out of 10, the user chooses this option when faced with this type of disruption. That then becomes the default choice and can even be automated. That's exactly how we're approaching this problem. There are some really good examples we have about multi-agent collaboration that's allowing us to demonstrate this, particularly on the network, and it's really exciting.
So Gurdip and George, you just kind of laid out sort of what people can expect going forward. Let's paint a clear picture. Gurdip, before we went live, you were sharing, some great analogies about looking in the rear view mirror. I mean, essentially we had this batch process. You had this analytic system of record, which told you what happened yesterday, and maybe told you what happened, and maybe to a certain extent why it happened. You could sort of infer that, but didn't have a lot of predictive power. So paint a picture of how you'd compare the traditional legacy siloed approaches to what you're describing in this, which is an integrated, it's an end-to-end, near real time, a system of agency that you're building and have built.
Yeah. So I'm gonna date myself here, Dave, but if you go back to the 70s and 80s and the heyday of the ERP, it served an important purpose, an important stepping stone to kind of bringing together for the CFO all of the information that allowed them to make, to not just record what has happened, but then to be able to analyze and suggest improvements, so that activity-based costing element could do wonders for an enterprise that didn't have visibility into any of that information. But like you correctly said, I think of that as somewhat looking in the rearview mirror. That tells me what happened yesterday, and sure, I can use some of that information to predict what might happen in the future. But it's a limited view. Let's acknowledge that it doesn't have the entirety of the view of the network, of the ecosystem of suppliers and carriers. It does not provide that shared reality for all of the stakeholders to think about what the objectives and functions might be, as the objectives and constraints might be as you try to make a decision. And so particularly in today's day and age, when you are in the kind of, I'd call it the age of uncertainty, it's almost like you're driving down real fast, a real winding hill, with trying to do that while looking at the rearview mirror if you're relying purely on your ERP to help you get there. I would suggest that it would be much better if we, like we would normally do, evaluate the situation that's coming ahead, make decisions, and even have a plan A and a plan B to deal with contingencies and get to the bottom of the hill safely and as quickly as we can. And navigating that requires you to break from the shackles of what the ERP would have done for you. And all of these technological capabilities I talked about that are now part of the Blue Yonder platform, including the data cloud, including the knowledge graph, including the network, and all of the capabilities around unified decisioning in the concurrent ways I described, allow you to make that journey possible. And so in many ways, I think we as an economy and as a business community need to transcend and move away from the traditional ways of how things have been done over the last couple of 3 decades or more, and get into this age where business decisions are made for this age of uncertainty, and the tools think about uncertainty as a first-class citizen in how the technology has been built.
Thank you for that. I'll give you the last word here, Gurdip. I just make it going back to, I'll date myself as well. I dye my hair gray. And so I remember, and in the technology industry, we talk about these technology companies that have $1 trillion plus valuations, and it's obviously very exciting, but a sharp analyst one time on Wall Street said, you know, the real value that ERP brought, you probably couldn't have picked SAP as the winner at the time. It was kind of confusing, but then as SAP emerged, great company, et cetera. But the real value was created by the customers. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. Those that can apply and take advantage of this technology are collectively going to create more value than a single technology vendor. So, you know, that's a sort of to me, a sign of a great company that can deliver more value than it extracts. So, but I'll give you the last word on the future. And I'd like to ask you, I mean, help our audience understand what is available today, what kind of value they can get today, and what they can expect in the future. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, no, so I'll answer both those questions, Dave. So first and foremost, this ability to bring trading partners together in a manner that makes it not just good for them, but good for their customers is at the heart of Blue Yonder's mission of delivering sustainable abundance. I don't think we would be successful if all we did was bring the technology to bear and we weren't able to bring the content and this collaboration and orchestration across the entire ecosystem. And so we're very committed to this path, that's been the North Star for us as we try to solve this problem of uncertainty that's plaguing our customers today. I think when I think about how this evolution is going to play out going forward, I see a number of different avenues in which technology will continue to evolve. But best of all, it's this coming together of humans and machines and agents in a manner that will bring, I think, a new age of both productivity and abundance in how supply chains and businesses are operated. And to me, that will be the goal that I'm sure both Blue Yonder and many other technology partners will pursue.
Well, it's a remarkable story of a company that has transformed itself. And so congratulations and best of luck. Gurdip, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, George. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Okay, we're taking an in-depth look at the future of business and planning with Blue Yonder, a fantastic example of an intelligent data application platform. George and I will be right back right after this short break.